Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast channel for sustainable procurement. We hope you like what you hear. Please go to www.iso2400.org for more information, learning resources, tools, and much more.
So, hello everybody, and welcome to Sense and Sustainability, our series of broadcasts to try and get behind the people, movers and shakers around sustainable procurement, to understand a little bit about what motivates them, a little bit about their drivers, how they got to where they got to in their careers, and where they see the future. So I'm delighted to introduce Jean-Louis from France. But actually, Jean-Louis, when we first met, I think it was in Iguazu in Brazil, on the ISO 2400 delegation, you actually turned up in Brazil representing the Australian delegation. So tell us your story. And tell us about your career up to that point where we met and what got you to Iguazu, what got you into sustainable procurement.
Hi, Sean. Thanks for inviting me. For me, it all started in 2003, when back then I was thinking about what I wanted to do as a career. And actually, by chance, met a person that talked to me about fair trade. He was the president of the French Fair Trade Organization. And I got interested in that topic. And so that's how I started my career, actually. I did my first job was to conduct an audit of the fair trade olive oil supply chain in Palestine back in 2006. So that was a bit special. And so then I continued to work for fair trade and worked for basically international solidarity NGOs. But at some point, I started to think that maybe I would like to support and advise organizations rather than lobby against them or lead campaigns. And that's how I got to work for a procurement consultancy. Back in 2008, I started to work for a procurement consultancy that was investing in sustainable procurement in France. So I worked 5 years for these guys in France and conducted a lot of advisory work for public bodies, but also big groups, internationals. And then my fiancée said, I'm fed up with France. I want to leave. I want to go somewhere else. And we ended up in Australia. So when I arrived in Australia, new migrant, average level of English, I started to work in a procurement consultancy, but I said, I really want to continue to work on sustainable procurement. So I knew there was this project of an ISO standard on sustainable procurement. And so I actually created the Australian delegation. I said that's my way to get people to know me and to reinvest sustainable procurement. So that's how I got to work with a few other people to create the Australian delegation. And then I took the leadership of that delegation. And that's how I met you, Sean, back in 2014 in Brazil. And so that ISO project was really, for me, a channel to reinvest or to redirect my career to sustainable procurement. And then on the back of that, we created with a few other people and yourself, Sean, Action Sustainability in Australia, did some advisory work. Then I joined KPMG in 2020 and then back to France in Nantes to be close to the family. So if you think about my story, Sean, it's basically, when I was very young, fair trade, super interesting. And then interesting, but I really want to advise big corporates to do the right thing in sustainable procurement. And then I just continued with sustainable procurement because I thought it was so, you never get bored. There's always more to do. And we're still in the early phases of maturity for most organizations. So there's so much to do. So that's why I never left that space.
So it's from Nantes to Sydney and then back again?
Yes, that's it. And never again in Paris.
Never in Paris, absolutely. How does it feel? It's interesting. I mean, there's a couple of interesting things about your career. First of all, starting with NGOs. And as you quite rightly pointed out, that there's a big difference between what NGOs do and what advisory businesses do. And I find it's quite hard for some people to make the transition because you kind of come in for an NGO, nothing's ever good enough. You're always kind of push, and campaigning rather than advising and assuring. How did you feel about that transition? Because I know some people that have worked for me on and off in the business kind of get a little bit too far on the campaigning trail, and they're kind of trying to, I suppose, push their customers' conscience rather than giving them advice as a business. Can you talk a bit more about that difference between the sort of two career points?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess you have to accept you are an advisor. You have to accept that you your goal is to help your client to progress, right? So it involves sometimes being very pragmatic and realistic about what an organization can cope, and making sure somehow you protect the interest of your client. So you are inside, you're not outside. However, as an advisor, as a trusted advisor, you also have to say or talk about some very difficult elements or the truth that your client has to hear. That is to say, maybe the breach of international standards, or the fact that if they don't, and I know we agree on that, Sean, if they are not using a strategic approach to sustainable procurement and trying to influence the leadership about the business case for sustainability and sustainable procurement, and the way you have to integrate that into the strategy and the governance at the highest level of the organization, it's not going to change. So I guess you have to be pragmatic and realistic, but also you have to be professional and say the right things and the truth to your client, even though it's difficult for them to hear that. So I've always felt that sometimes you have clients where you know that it's going to be hard for them to progress, and you're just doing the work, and you just say, I don't think there's a lot of hope with that client just yet. So and then you leave, because as a consultant you don't stay forever. But when you have the opportunity to drive strategic change, including in terms of the mindset of those leaders, then you have to do it.
Is there, if we look at the sort of ethical side of clients that we work with, I'm always in the middle of a debate about, do you work with the really, really good guys who probably don't need our advice? Or are you working with, making bad clients less bad? Are there sectors, are there organizations that you wouldn't work for, given your background as an NGO? Do you draw sort of ethical lines around who you may or may not work for?
That's a tough question, Sean. That's a very tough question, because the sectors that are on the blacklist, it's moving as well. So I did that work with a zoo. Remember the Taronga Zoo in Sydney?
I do.
So these guys, they have a lot of sponsors and partnerships, and they were thinking about what are those sectors we'll never work with. And of course, they had tobacco, they have weapons, and they had prostitution, and that was it. I think maybe a few others, but those the typical ones. But then the new type of sector that was coming to the mind of those people was those sectors that were massively contributing to climate change, like mining. But then it was not black and white, because some people were saying, like mining, some are transitioning to better mining maybe, or something a bit more compatible with the climate change issue. So I think we've already said, for example, in previous, we were approached by gambling. Gambling is a new one as well. Gambling and horse riding and all that. So we decided a few years ago not to advise that gambling company. So it's a tough one, because I guess they are the easy ones, the easy sectors. Yeah, I'll never work for tobacco. So that's an easy one for me. But then you have those sectors that are becoming part of the blacklist, but not yet. So instead of reflecting about it in terms of sectors, I think that you have to ask yourself, is this company willing to progress? Yeah. And even though they are maybe not there yet, can you have an influence there? And if you think they don't have an influence, that you're just gonna help them to produce a better report, then maybe it's not the right thing to do to work for those guys. So there's the concept of progress, and there's the concept of, do we have leaders that are on board of that progress? Yeah. So it's a tough question, Sean. What do you think about that one? What's your view?
Yeah, it's a judgment call, isn't it? And as you say, it's kind of how willing and how real and genuine is the business that you're looking to advise, or are they just looking for a bit of greenwash? And yeah, I think it has to be judged on a case by case basis. I mean, I did some work for the World Cup in Qatar on the back of work that I'd done for the London Olympics. And that was a bit of a tough call. And if I'm honest, I don't think the sustainable procurement policy that I developed for them ever saw the light of day. So, maybe that wasn't the best decision on my part. In the UK, we work for the Ministry of Defence. And the concept of sustainable warfare is quite a difficult one to get your head around. But, that they're a genuine body of a democratically elected government. The carbon footprint of the MOD dwarfs every other department in the UK. So why wouldn't we try to help them to reduce their carbon footprint? So I think I feel similar to you about, industries like tobacco and gambling probably wouldn't go there. But as you say, I think it's very much a judgment call, and something that we always need to consider. I think it's important as well. We often consult with our own employees around how do they feel about working for different types of organisations, because I think it's very important to take our people with us. Another question for you. You and I have worked together in Australia, and I find Australia interesting because they speak English, well, kind of, and you sort of tend to think that the culture between the UK and Australia will be very similar, but actually it's not. And you've obviously, worked all over, but you've gone from France to Australia and back to France again. And I know you've worked a little in the UK as well and in other countries. How do you feel about the cultural differences, particularly between Australia and France?
I feel like I had more nicer clients in Australia. I don't know why, but I think
I'm sure your countrymen are going to love one.
Well, I really saw the difference between Paris and Sydney. I think in Australia, because of, I guess, a few things. That's really my personal opinion, and there's nothing scientific about it. Sure,
absolutely.
But the unemployment rate is really low. It is a country, and especially Sydney, the economy is booming. So I guess people are more relaxed about their jobs and changing their jobs, right? So I think it impacts the fact that people are more relaxed in general, right? The second thing is, there's, in terms of work-life balance, it's really a key element in Australia. You could see, for example, in job ads, always something about work-life balance, right? Which, if you think about Paris, is the total opposite. It's everything for work. I think also that the fact that in Sydney you have a lot of new migrants, of third generation, second generation, or third generation. That's most of the population, and it's very international, even more than Paris. That thing about people coming to Australia with a migrant mindset. I want to get accepted. I want to work hard. And I also want to feel respected for who I am. It is a kind of an atmosphere of respect that is really helping the work-related relationships, I think. Also, the way that the management is dealing with their employees, and also somehow about how the clients are dealing with their suppliers. Or at least, for me, being a consultant, I really felt that the clients were easier to work with. So sorry for France, but I think on that aspect, Australia was very nice to work. The thing I like about France, because I have to say something positive about France, in addition to wine and cheese and all this great food we have, is that I think the French culture is much stronger on, I guess, being critical, talking about tough topics, social topics, which was really hard to discuss in Australia. People feel ill at ease with some topics. In France, it's like we like to argue all the time, so it's much easier. So I like that about France, that ability to talk about tough topics, being quite critical, which is making us progress somehow.
So you've recently returned to France. How are you seeing the world of sustainable procurement in France? I certainly see it as being quite well advanced, possibly slightly different to the way the rest of the world is doing it. But some of the sort of demands for transparency, ethical standards down the value chain seem to be quite well ahead in France. So how are you seeing things, and how are you seeing the future of sustainable procurement in France?
Yeah, I was really impressed, really, when I came back. So I left in 2012, came back almost 10 years after, and the first thing that impressed me was the quantity of people that have a role in sustainable procurement. They really multiplied by 100. And so that was really, that struck me. The second thing that I would say about France is that the proactivism of the state in terms of first setting regulations like the devoir de vigilance, which is kind of the equivalent to the Modern Slavery Act with a broader scope. So that was one thing which is playing its part, but also the fact that the state launched a sustainable procurement certification program, which is aligned to ISO 20400, and which is quite strong. It's gonna grow in terms of number of certified organizations. It's not there yet, but it's quite strong. So that's that involvement of the state in terms of developing standards and certifications is quite strong. In terms of the public procurement as well, the state has continued to encourage public bodies to implement sustainable procurement with stronger objectives. And then you have some regulations on some very hot topics, CSR hot topics. We have a law on climate and resilience to climate change, which is talking about procurement. We also have a law on waste and circular economy, which is clearly talking about procurement. So you have different laws like that are going to push all the companies and public organizations to the next level. So in a word, it's state intervention. This is very French, but in that case, that intervention of the state, of the government is really, in my view, helping to get to the next level.
Yeah, it's another thing about culture, isn't it? As well, it's the French culture is quite rules based, and
yes,
probably France is further ahead than probably any other country I know in terms of setting out those regulations for sustainable procurement. Now, that's less likely to work in countries like the UK or Australia or the US, where we're practically allergic to rules. But in France, it works, doesn't it? Certainly, that's what I see as an outsider.
Yes, definitely. The counterpart to that is that if there are no rules, people will say, I'm not moving because there are no rules. So we've been waiting for those rules to happen for a while. We need more rules, basically, in France. It's going to work. So yeah, I'm quite pleased about the way it's evolving. Yeah, there's so much more to do. We all know about that. It's probably a century of work till we get to the level we want to be.
Yeah, I probably won't see that out. You might possibly, but I don't. Okay, listen, thanks very much, Jean-Louis. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and to get your insights, and particularly I hope our listeners are kind of interested in your journey from Australia or France to Australia and back again, and how that sustainable procurement agenda has actually developed for you. And also, what's happening in France. I think we can learn a lot from some of the great sustainable procurement work that's been going on in France, as you say, for 10 years or more now. And the fact that a lot of people have specific roles in sustainable procurement. I think we're starting to see that in the UK as well now as a growing movement. But we can certainly continue to learn from each other. So thanks very much for joining me today. And I do hope our listeners enjoy listening to you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
Thank you for listening to our podcast on Sense and Sustainability. Please listen out for more episodes. For more information, learning resources, tools, and much more content on sustainable procurement, go to www.iso2400.org.